Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, if I may say that. I'm Karen Varley, founder and director of Conservatives for Women, the only grassroots organisation in the Conservative Party solely dedicated to women's rights and child safeguarding. We have over 1,000 members, and almost half of those are active Conservative Party members. So we think they're a very important group to talk to. Do come along to our stand. We are on 204A, which we are considering renaming 9 3/4, as we are between the Football Association and the Young Conservatives. So quite an unusual position. Thank you to our co-host, Conservative Home, for helping us put this event on in a very short timescale, particularly to Angus, who has tolerated my 5 a.m. emails. And do bear in mind, we are completely reliant on donors for our work. Most of our team are volunteers, and I'd particularly like to thank the donors who've enabled us to put this event on, and they know who they are. So do come and have some conversations. I'll hand over now to our panel and our esteemed chair, journalist and broadcaster Camilla Tomini. Camilla.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Now we're going to gather to talk about something quite serious, something which is difficult to talk about, something which at times the debate appears to have been closed down, particularly to women wanting to occupy that space. So it's great to have an all-female panel here to discuss the safeguarding of children. We know in context what's happened since the lid was somewhat blown off the Tavistock Clinic. We've seen Dr. Hilary Cass's interim report questioning whether some of the medical interventions when it comes to children presenting themselves with suffering from gender dysphoria and distress may be doing more harm than good. And obviously we do await the full outcome of that inquiry, but at the moment, the concern that has been raised is that children are being placed almost automatically on a medical pathway that may not cure them of their gender dysphoria, but make them even worse, and indeed that some pathways may be taken where parents aren't fully informed of what's going on. We're awaiting the government's guidance, trans guidance for schools, that's still to come. And therefore, we're going to discuss some of the issues that arise from the context of what's been going on when it comes to children and gender distress now. So let me just introduce the panel. On my far left, we have Fuchsia Hyde. She is the co-founder of the Bayswater Support Group, which she'll explain to us in just a moment what that group does. Next to me, I have Miriam Cates, MP. She's the Education Committee member and co-chair of the New Conservatives, and very much a voice on the right when it comes to the safeguarding of children in this particular area. And on my right, I've got Lottie Moore, who's head of biology matters at the Policy Exchange and very much does believe that biology matters. So let's begin with Miriam Cates, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Camilla. And it is an honour to be here. It's great to have a packed audience. So I just thought I'd explain how I kind of came across this debate and how I've started speaking about it in Parliament and the kind of movement that we've got within Parliament now starting to try to push back against some of what's going on in schools. So I was elected in 2019. I'm one of the new, although not so new now, Conservative MPs. I used to be a teacher. I've got a background in science. And before I was elected, I was aware in some schools through friends of friends that this was becoming an issue, that more and more children were saying that they were trans, they were asking to be called by the opposite gender, opposite pronouns. And I assumed that this was, I believed it was happening, but I assumed that it was few and far between. But then when I got into Parliament, got more involved with education issues, and then in fact 2 years ago, Anne Jenkin on the front row hosted an event at conference, which was the first of this type really, gathering together people who are involved in this issue. People like Helen Joyce have been so influential, and starting to find out more of these stories and the fact that it wasn't isolated, but it was becoming more and more prevalent in schools. And so I started to speak about this in Parliament as a safeguarding issue and ask whether it was right, what were the impacts of telling children that you could change gender, of changing a child's name and sex potentially without even their parent knowing. And people like Fuchsia, who will explain her journey many in a minute, started writing to me and telling me their stories. And soon I had dozens and dozens and then hundreds of stories from parents in my inbox, absolutely tragic stories about relationships that have been completely broken down, schools doing absolutely atrocious things. One example, which I'll try and keep the details to a minimum, but in the Brighton area, of a girl who was not only transitioned by the school without her parents' knowledge, but sent off to a GP who gave her testosterone and then injected it, and before the parents knew, it was too late, and they now have no relationship with this child. So the more I spoke about it, the more I heard about it. And really, we've just gathered in Parliament a group of like-minded MPs and peers, and increasingly just tried to speak out about it more. And it's interesting that Camilla introduced me as being someone on the right, and I can own that label. But isn't it odd that speaking about the protection of children and stopping the indoctrination of children is seen as a niche right-wing issue? Well, first of all, it's not niche. This is happening everywhere. And Lottie's report, which she'll explain in a minute, shows the percentage of schools that accept that gender is a fluid thing. But also, it's a very convenient debate for those on the left to label as a culture war, because that makes it possible to shut it down. And I think that's what we're fighting against, really, is the kind of adult agenda of what does this mean for adults? How do we make out that it is actually a matter of safety for children and not just some peripheral culture war. And Fuchsia will talk about some of the tragic impacts on individual families, but I just want to reflect for a moment on what this means from a bigger picture point of view. So not just for the sake of the children who are being transitioned, what does that mean for their long-term health? What does it mean for their long-term relationships? But also, what does it mean for all children in school who are being told by trusted adults that gender is fluid, that sex doesn't matter? For girls particularly, that you shouldn't object to having a boy in your toilets, that you shouldn't complain when a boy comes into your changing room. What psychological impact is that going to have on a whole generation? And those are the kind of questions that I think need to be asked. And I think politically, the government has a huge opportunity in producing this guidance for schools. So for those of you who aren't aware, the government's been promising it must be getting on for 18 months now to produce guidance to schools on how to address children who present with gender dysphoria. Because, of course, it's an extremely difficult thing for a head teacher when encountering a child who's demanding to be known by the opposite gender, the opposite pronouns. Parents are going along with it and want it too. It's very difficult for a head teacher to be able to interpret the quagmire of equalities legislation that we have in this country and know what to do. So the buck should stop with the DfE. DfE should be producing guidance. But of course, it's very difficult in the current political climate to do that. But I think our role as parliamentarians is very much to pressure the government to produce that guidance quickly, but to make sure that it is clear and black and white, and that it says to schools that you don't have the authority to transition a child. It is experimental. We don't know the long-term outcomes. But those are the battles we're having because, as I said, the legal situation is very difficult. But hopefully, if we can get through that, it will not only be brilliant for child safeguarding, but also a real political opportunity for Conservatives, because I do think most people, the common sense view, are absolutely on our side, and it's up to us to speak up for them.
Thanks, Miriam. Lottie, take us through your research and let's have some facts and figures on what you've discovered.
Thank you. Yes, so I work at Policy Exchange. We're the only think tank in Westminster to have a dedicated unit to sex and gender. And essentially, I wrote a report in March called Asleep at the Wheel. There are some copies at the back, so please do grab one. And yeah, basically, we thought that I'd heard, obviously, Miriam and others and parents and teachers have been talking and saying that this issue was going on, but there was still very much a narrative that it was just one dodgy school or a couple of dodgy schools, and it wasn't really happening and it wasn't widespread. And so I wanted to disprove that thesis. So in December last year, I sent out over 300 Freedom of Information requests to a random number of maintained secondary schools and academies in England, basically asking them questions, quite simple questions about safeguarding and gender. And so I'll just read you through what I found. Only 28% of schools are reliably informing parents when a child discloses feelings of gender distress. 33% are not informing their designated safeguarding lead when a child discloses gender distress. 4 in 10 schools are operating policies of gender self-ID, which basically means if a child declares that they're the opposite gender, then that's what they go by. At least 28% not maintaining single-sex toilets. 19% not maintaining single-sex changing rooms. and 60% were allowing children to participate in sports of the opposite sex. 69% of schools were requiring all the other children to affirm a gender-distressed child's new identity. And then we also asked some questions on RSHE. 72% of schools were teaching that people have a gender identity that is different from their biological sex. 25% teaching that some children, quote, can be born in the wrong body. And 30% were teaching pupils that a person who self-identifies as a man or a woman should be treated as such in all circumstances, even if this doesn't match their biological sex, which obviously that's just not what the law says. So essentially, I think the point that this report wanted to make, and what I would want to make, is that if there's so much disagreement at a clinical level, as you mentioned, Dr. Hilary Cass has demonstrated that at secondary, primary, specialist level, doctors, there isn't really a consensus as to what to do. We know that social transition is an active medical intervention. That's what Dr. Cass has said. If it's not clear what should be happening to these children in clinical settings, then it certainly is not the place for schools to be enacting essentially medical interventions, which is what we've found that they're doing. And so that would be, my main point is that gender distress in children is a safeguarding issue, and there is a huge blind spot in schools when it comes to this. Schools need the trans guidance desperately. In fact, I shouldn't call it trans guidance because it's safeguarding guidance is really what it is. They need the piece of paper that tells them what to do, because once a child comes to school and says, this is who I want to be, parents and teachers and other students have to basically accept this, and that's not as the evidence shows, that's not appropriate.
Thank you, Lottie. Fuchsia, let's bring you in now. Tell us what the Bayswater support group does, and then I think you've got some stories to tell us about what's been going on.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here today, and it's a pleasure to be in Manchester, which is interesting because it was Manchester in 2019, the other thing that happened otherwise, other than Miriam getting elected, obviously. But very, very sadly, it was the weekend of a detransitioners conference that we decided to launch the Bayswater group. But prior to that, we were just a bunch of parents who were completely isolated and quite marginalised, who just blindsided by what children were telling us. And the only advice given out was always affirm, get them on puberty blockers as soon as possible. If you don't accept this, then you've got the problem. And of course, any parents who were a bit cautious about that or questioning that were very, very quickly shut down. And also some of the parents who were already at GIDS at that stage, thinking that GIDS would give them a thorough assessment and, would clearly see that their child didn't meet the kind of any of the historical criteria, only to find that this child was rapidly affirmed on the first appointment, and all the parents, actually I know, whose children went through GIDS, all of them have been medicalised. So that was the kind of environment that we started out in. We called ourselves Bayswater because we met all in a Bayswater hotel under kind of total cover, because it was a very frightening time at that stage for parents. I think it's got a bit easier, very much thanks to some big names shifting the Overton window for us, or as Douglas Murray would say, kind of clearing the way with landmines. But it's still very challenging on the ground. So at the moment, we've got just over 630 families who we support. We're across the UK and Northern Ireland, and we even have some parents in Ireland who we support because they've been referred to GIDS. And the statistics very much match everything else that's out there. It's just over 70% girls and 29 to 30% boys. Depends. We kind of keep statistics on it, for each member, but it very much reflects the picture that's out there. And the overwhelming majority of those children didn't mention a single thing about anything to do with gender. or appear to have any confusion or anything like that until they were past the early stages of puberty. And the other thing which is quite interesting, when we first started, we found that it was overwhelmingly online, which was how children encountered VID. For girls, it tended to be very much like YouTube influencers, and for boys, more kind of Reddit, Discord. And then another thing happened in 2019 when it became mandatory to teach gender identity in schools. So that was the first kind of thing that made it, so suddenly the number started to bump up a lot due to that. And then we had lockdown. And we did naively think, well, maybe because this is all kind of so scary and everything, people have something else to focus on. But no, it actually put a hell of a lot of rocket fuel under the fire, because children who were before online, a lot of the children, they would come to it because they're already vulnerable, they're already quite socially isolated children. As we know, I think hopefully by now, that the vast majority of these children have underlying either neurodevelopmental conditions, autism, ADHD, or trauma, and a lot of them being bullied. So they're quite socially isolated type of children to be spending more time online. In lockdown, you got everyone spending time online. So it widened it out to a larger group of children. And so now we're in a situation when children, we had a sudden bump in numbers, and the schools are all had been primed that if a child says that they're trans, they just go along with it. So, everything is just scaffolded around affirming that child. And it creates this pipeline effect where, the child, it's an unstoppable force once they're on that kind of pathway. And parents, of course, are completely sidelined as a result of all of this, and seen, I wouldn't say, maybe not as, by the child, they can be seen as the enemy. Some schools, a lot of schools have started social services referrals for parents not going along. There's all kinds of ways that have been used to try and coerce parents to go along with that. So our work that we've done it's been very much a moving goal of trying just to support parents in this environment, in some incredibly traumatic situations, and just raising awareness with people that not to take it at face value, that just because a child says that they're trans, they're not, there's other stuff going on. That should be a signal to look beneath the bonnet, because there's a lot of other stuff going on there, and that child probably needs safeguarding. And the first thing that any adult in the room should be looking at is, how has the child arrived at that conclusion? And yeah, so here we are today. I'm very glad that we have so much support now. So thank you.
Thanks, Prisha. Thank you. Just to explain, because Pusha's referred there to GIDS, which is the Gender Identity Service that is run out of the Tavistock. So that was the name of the gender identity clinic that ran from Tavistock. Looks after children with lots of different needs, but that was that specific programme which has been halted because Hilary Cass's interim support report has basically said it doesn't have the it doesn't have clinically based evidence to suggest that children should be put on this medicalised pathway. A, that it's good for them, and B, that it helps them, because others obviously have questioned whether actually blocking puberty itself could be a cure for gender dysphoria, ironically, and yet some of these children are obviously, well, a lot of them are being held in kind of limbo. Just go back to you, Lottie. We will open it out to questions in a moment. I was just going to ask a few questions just to get some basis of understanding in this. I mean, you're talking about a situation where 28% of schools weren't telling parents that children were transitioning. You've mentioned, Fuchsia, this mandatory discussion of gender identity in schools. How did this actually happen? Because from a parental point of view, we went from a situation where actually we didn't call it transgenderism. We had a knowledge of transsexual peoples, we had a knowledge of people perhaps being born of indiscriminate gender. That was quite a niche thing. There's a different thing going on with transvestites. Transgenderism as a concept is a fairly new one, and we seem to have gone from 0 to 100 miles an hour in schools. I mean, is it because, do you put it down to kind of left-leaning ideology in schools? Is it because everyone's running scared of being branded TERF, so doing what the trans activists want? How did it come to pass that we have a situation where a quarter of all schools don't tell parents if their own kids want to self-ID as another gender?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of those things. I would say, what I thought was really, I mean, in context, a teacher cannot administer paracetamol to a child without parental permission. You have to sign 2 forms in order to allow, if a child has a headache, to give them paracetamol. And yet these kids are being put on a potentially irreversible medical pathway. It is absolutely astounding. What I thought was really interesting when we were given reasons in my FOIs for why parents weren't informing teachers was this phrase, unsupportive. And so it was this idea that unsupportive parents might not be supportive, therefore, we have to keep this a secret, we can't tell the parents. And I just think it's so interesting that this whole thing has completely flipped on its head the idea of what constitutes a supportive parent. Like parents who do not consent to unlicensed medical intervention on their child are not unsupportive, and they certainly don't pose a safeguarding risk to their own children. I think lobbying groups have an awful lot of responsibility for this. Stonewall, Mermaids, Stonewall. I mean, they've all been in schools. Stonewall by 2015, and they started off quite good noble aims. LGBT rights, and then in 2015, they kind of had conquered the cause, and so they were like, well, what are we going to do next? Let's bring the tea in. And but in 2015, they were in thousands of schools. So that's when it started. And actually, it's in the report, but there is guidance from Stonewall to teachers that explicitly says, do not inform, LGBT. It's not always appropriate to tell parents, and parents can be unsupportive. Schools are not in the business of keeping secrets. You just don't do that.
But also, I know there's a group called Transgender Trend. Any parent in this room often has to attribute unusual behaviour to their children to it being a phase. What I found interesting about Cath's report is the numbers. Back in 2010, there were about 100 or 200 children presenting at the Tavistock with gender dysphoria. By 2019, there is like 10 to 12,000. Before you answer that, because I'll come on to you, Fuchsia, because I'm interested in the detransitioner stories. Miriam, the criticism will be that this has happened under the Conservatives' watch, and the Conservatives are meant to be the family party. They're meant to be looking out for children more than anyone.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I would be as critical as anyone of the fact that we have allowed this to do it. The DFE have just closed their eyes. They pretended this isn't a problem, and then they've supported the problem as something that's progress. But a counter to that would be that this is happening across the Western world, and it's certainly no worse in this country than in a lot of places. In fact, perhaps not in schools, but our general narrative has actually shifted quite a lot in the last couple of years. As Fuchsia said, we've had big names like J.K. Rowling. We've had lots of left-wing feminists as well as those of us on the right pushing back against this. And there are some countries in the world that look at us as TERF Island. We are holding the fort against gender ideology. So I think, of course, you can blame the government, but I think this would have happened under anybody's watch. And the reasons for that is that this ideology has come through our institutions and in spite of our institutions rather than from the top down. And I think part of that is because we have imported this kind of academic far left ideology. It's not just gender ideology, it's the kind of critical race theory, extreme climate catastrophism, those kind of things that started in the 60s in the States, and we've imported them over, and they've come through universities. It's no coincidence that my generation, nearly 50% of people went to university. What a surprise, they're now all teaching children in universities and schools. So I think this ideology would have come into our schools regardless of who was in power, and that's not to say we shouldn't have pushed back on it. But I think, as you said, the rapid rise in the numbers, I think it is partly because this is just socially contagious, because it gives children who are going through puberty, which is a naturally difficult time, a time that requires you to ask questions of yourself and your future. And of course, it preys on vulnerable children. But social media has an awful lot to answer for. And if you look at the rise in this and the rise in teen mental health difficulties, it absolutely correlates with the rise of social media and, of course, the ability to share these ideas very quickly and without parents knowing. And I think that what's fundamental to this is actually a modern ideology that your identity is something that you discover rather than something that you negotiate and you build on. So in the past, we had this idea of kind of virtues and values, and you are born into a family. You don't have a choice about that. You're born into a community and a nation. You don't have a choice about that. It's your parents' responsibility and your responsibility to become the kind of person that contributes to society. Now we tell kids that they have to discover who they are. And what happens if they discover they are something that they think their parents won't like? I mean, it's made up. It's not true, but it's so pernicious that this is what is letting schools say, oh, goodness, these parents might not be safe because they don't like their child's identity, whatever that means. And we've got to call it out. The only way to stop this is to call it out for what it is, which is it's made up. And it's not that some people don't deeply believe it, they do, but it isn't true. And I think the more we switch the lights on and let people see under the hood of this, the more people will convince that actually it's just a fad that hopefully we can fight against.
Okay. I mean, obviously, we'd be going down huge rabbit holes to start talking about, multi-genders, is biological sex immutable or not? I mean, we just start dealing with the kind of biological factors we know it. So as we want to keep this on safeguarding, I suppose for you, Fuchsia, the question is, there will be some children and indeed some parents who say that after their children were given puberty blockers, things did work out better for them. They're happy living in a different gender. Regardless of what people in the room or beyond think of that, that may have been the solution for them. But when you talk about detransitioners conferences, we know about the case of Kira Bell, who obviously wished that she hadn't taken the puberty blockers and indeed had a double mastectomy. Do you think that there's a time bomb about to go off? And what's the extent of it? Because obviously you're saying this isn't the solution to these children, but some of these children and parents will say it absolutely is.
I think there's so many just unknowns, because what was really interesting about the detransitioners conference is that all of those detransitioners there, they had fulfilled the traditional diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So they weren't the novel cohort which was influenced. They were they were the typical extremely gender non-conforming children who had kind of felt very, who fitted the kind of the narrative about that, and yet they all had said, well, why was, they were all very, very unhappy at the outcomes, having been put on that pathway, having been told that this was the solution. And I think initially it's very well known that there is this kind of honeymoon phase, and I think anyone in medicine, how powerful the placebo effect is. That's why they have the randomised, controlled, double-blind trials as the highest standard, because of just how high the placebo effect is. And there's never been a single piece of evidence that's even been controlled, let alone that kind of gold standard, to know that that is what is causing any benefit at all when people are talking about puberty blockers in terms of self-report. But what we do know is that they are undoubtedly very, harm is caused by the medical pathway without any shadow of doubt. I mean, it makes, if you have puberty block, the Dutch protocol, puberty blockers followed by hormones will make you sterile. And then there's all the other issues around osteoporosis. People have talked up to drop in IQ by 15 points. And so we just, in terms of that, we just don't really know how it's going to pan out at the moment. In our group alone, we do see not insignificant amounts of desistance with children coming out the other side. Some of them who've been in it very, very deeply with absolute certainty and have dabbled in testosterone, because testosterone and estrogen now are effectively being used as like drugs in the way that any other kind of illegal Class A drug is being used in schools and supplied the same way. So children are experimenting on that. And those children are they're coming out the other side, and suddenly, as maturity kicks in, realising it's not for them.
But are they saying...
We just don't know.
But are they saying to their parents, how did you let this happen? Or are they saying, are they actually questioning the lack of clinical basis to it all? Or are they saying, I don't feel any better than I did when I was younger, so why has this happened to me?
well, I mean, it's all just very different for each circumstances. I mean, we have got definitely parents where the children were very, very angry at not being affirmed, and we're seeing some of the charities who were encouraging them to legally change their names. They were taking them to appointments, and those children have come out the other side and said, you know, you did completely the right thing, and you were right. And just very shocked that the other adults in the room would be doing stuff like that. I mean, I've heard of a parent of a male at a school where he was allowed to change his name, and the mum didn't want it. And then he realised that he was gay and saying, well, why the hell did the school I mean, he goes, I was 13, like, what were they thinking? And so we are hearing that. But I mean, it just depends, because at the same time, you know, to have the level of self-awareness that we're thinking about of adults, to kind of reflect back on that requires a lot of maturity, time, wisdom, reflection, and like stable kind of state of mind. And we are talking about some very vulnerable children here who have some pretty complex psychosocial conditions, who are also in the throes of adolescence when their brain is being rewired. They won't necessarily, you know, and I think it's so important, and that's one of the big things about safeguarding, is to not try and project onto children or even adolescents or young adults how we feel as mature adults. And just to give them that and recognise that they are immature mentally, and to, you know, and yet they've been kind of given as a fate, you know, just like a whole identity just to try on as a solution to all their problems and psychic pain and everything about adolescence or that life at their stage that they're finding really hard. And that solution a lot of time is being presented to them by adults who are projecting onto them as children. And, you know, that again is a big safeguarding issue, because, you know, children are individuals. They deserve to their own space to grow up as individuals without people saying, oh, I was like that, therefore this is the solution.
Quick question to Lottie, and then we'll open it out to the floor. With regard to the DFE particularly, I mean, do people at the DFE need safeguarding training? You've made the point that it shouldn't be called trans guidance, it should be called safeguarding guidance. I mean, there seems to be a massive vacuum of knowledge here.
I think there is, yeah. I mean, yeah. I think the DFE needs, I mean, safeguarding is it's not particularly complex, really, you know. It's essentially, safeguarding is essentially providing a sort of security blanket, a kind of a net to catch children who are vulnerable, and whatever that looks like. And there is a big, long safeguarding document called Keeping Children Safe in Education. We called for that document to be updated to explicitly address gender distress. And every year, DFE re-release the guidance, and generally it's updated to reflect what's kind of gone on in that year. Very interestingly, in May, Keeping Children Safe in Education was updated, and given that this has been in the news constantly all year, there was absolutely no mention of gender distress. So, you know, the safeguarding gender guidance is one thing, but that's not going to be statutory. The statutory guidance is the safeguarding guidance. Schools have to abide by that guidance, and that's not been updated this year. So, you know, I think the DFE are certainly still asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, so the DFE, you're saying, aren't really adequately safeguarding children?
No, they're not. No.
Okay, let's open it to questions. Can you say where you're from before you speak? I'm going to go to Anne Jenkin first, as she's been involved in the organising of this event.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Conservative Home and Conservative Women for facilitating this event. I'm no biologist, but it's pretty clear to me that in order to turn from a child to an adult, you need hormones, and you've got to get through that period, which all of us had to do. I wanted to ask two questions. One was about the statutory, making it statutory, because if it's just guidance, we know that a lot of teachers won't go along with it, and any further views on that. The second part was about, as we're talking about online harms, is whether you think that pornography and access to pornography has had any influence on this huge rise in the number of girls in particular, 5,000% increase in the number of girls presenting with gender dysphoria, because there is certainly anecdotal evidence to show that if you see this frankly, pretty ghastly stuff, you will not want to become a woman because you are afraid of what it does to your body. And I wondered if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Miriam, thank you, Anne. Let's start with you in response to that question.
Well, I just want to firstly say thank you to Anne because, I mean, I don't know how many of you know, but she has led the charge in Parliament, gathering MPs and peers cross-party to share information on this, shall we say. So she deserves an enormous amount of credit for where we are on this. Yes, absolutely. So starting with the last question on porn, I mean, I do think online porn is probably the biggest safeguarding risk to children, perhaps even over this ideology, although I do agree that they're linked. And I think, the average age that a child sees extreme pornography is 13 now, and we just have no idea what impact this is going to have on future society, the kind of sex education, shall we say, that children are having. And I'm sure that it must be the case for some pubescent girls who see that and think that's what's expected of me sexually as a woman, no thank you. But also, and again, this is anecdotal, but you see an awful lot of trans women, so men, saying that it was trans porn that led them into, into the kind of trans arena. So I have no doubt that this is, this kind of extreme and violent and, very disturbing pornographic material on the internet has got a lot to do with it. Remind me the first question.
First one was, should the guidance be statutory?
Well, yes, I do think the guidance should be statutory, absolutely. But probably the best way to do that is to put it in the keeping children safe in education. There's a strong argument for that. However, even just publishing the guidance, even though you're absolutely right, there will be schools and activists that do ignore it, it is still a good thing to do. Firstly, because it puts the debate in the public sphere. If it's going to be judicially reviewed, great, let's have those arguments in public. I think that's a really good thing. But also, even if it's not statutory, it will make it more difficult for schools to transition to transition pupils, because there's an increasing number of parents who are actually taking legal action against schools for having done this, and if the guidance says that they shouldn't be doing it, that will give them a better case. So I think it's worth doing, even if it isn't statutory, but absolutely that should be our goal.
Just bring you in future, just on reflection as well on the point on pornography. I don't know what some of the children have said.
I think it absolutely, undoubtedly, it is having an impact, and I do think it is having an impact on girls as well. I mean, because I think people may be aware of the phenomenon of heterosexual girls identifying as gay men, and I do think
Heterosexual girls identifying as gay men.
yes, it's a thing.
So they still fancy boys, but they're now men.
I wasn't aware of that phenomenon. I am now.
I know.
Okay.
It takes you, and that does seem like that they are So I think the girls are getting some funny ideas about porn as well. But there's
Okay.
Yeah, they're going down some very strange rabbit holes.
There were so many questions. Let's have. Yes, madam.
My name's Fatima. I'm chair of one of Breckham's wards.
Okay.
Did anyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Via him, and I've talked to you, Miriam. I've talked to many MPs. They agree with everything here, but there seems to be inertia in the Conservative Party to be like Miriam, to be like Kemi.
Yeah.
How do you get rid of that inertia?
I mean, you do face a lot of abuse. It's not easy to come out on this side of the argument, especially if you're a woman. Somehow you can say these things if you're a man, but if you're a woman, you can't. Miriam.
Well, there are increasing numbers of MPs who are speaking out of it. And I think just to put the side of the MP, obviously we are bombarded with every kind of issue under the sun that you can think of. If I go through my inbox today, I've probably already got emails about keeping dogs safe, keeping kittens safe, saving trees. And as an MP, you have to pick a few topics that you can become specialist in. And obviously, if this is not something that you've heard of or that you're interested in, it's not going to be a specialist topic. And it's one of those topics that if you're not a specialist in, you really don't want to kind of step out into. So in my colleagues' defence, some people just haven't, they've not had the time. But there are increasing numbers who are willing to speak out. There's quite a few of them here in the audience today. And actually, I think that, yes, of course we do get some abuse, but if you are a Conservative, it is much easier to say this than if you're on the left, because people expect us to be Conservative. So I would encourage Conservative members and councillors and MPs that actually we probably get far less abuse than people on the left. So it's definitely worth stepping out. And you get an awful lot of, positive comments as well.
Well, to be fair, Rosie Duffield is a good example of
Exactly,
what it's like to be on the left and to have these
isolated
opinions.
and
Madam, with the glasses.
Hello panel, I'm Charlotte Kenyon, I'm a West Sussex County Councillor and also on the management team of LGB Alliance. I think you're doing fantastic work and anyone who hasn't read Lottie's report needs to do so. It's excellent, I read it when it came out. You mentioned legislation, Miriam, and I'll try and say this as cleanly as I can. Of the many things that are confusing about the Equality Act and related legislation, obviously Sex Matters has done some brilliant stuff on this, and I would recommend anyone to go and look at their website if they want some clear answers about what the legislation does and doesn't say. There was a fantastic debate in Westminster Hall. You contributed so eloquently, as did others, making it really unequivocally clear that when we talk about sex in these legislation, we're talking about biological sex and a whole host of other things that could be tidied up. One of the things that strikes me as odd about the Equality Act 2010, Section 8 that pertains to schools, which is relevant to this topic, is that the first sentence excludes the protected characteristics of sex and marriage or civil partnership, because clearly we segregate children on the basis of age, and children can't get married. But what it doesn't do is add gender reassignment to that list. When the notion of gender reassignment was born out of the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which does not include children in its scope, because children are not competent to make that decision and cannot apply for that. So why was gender reassignment not added to Section 8? I know you weren't an MP then, but I'm sure it's been part of your conversations. And is that in the crosshairs for some of the updates you might like to make to the legislation? And is there any hope of doing that before the next election so that we make sure it's done?
You quickly answer the point on the Equalities Act, and then I was going to bring you in afterwards, Lottie, on kind of Gillick competence and children's rights, perhaps. Carry on.
So I agree that our equalities legislation is mightily confused, and I think probably the reason for that anomaly is that nobody drafting the Equality Act it would have been drafted in 2008, 2009, could have possibly anticipated the epidemic in gender distress in children, and so it probably just wasn't thought of. I would love to bring some legislative changes before the election, although there are, of course, risks to opening up the Equality Act in primary legislation because people on the other side can also put amendments. Personally, I think we should go into the next election with a legislative plan for change, and I would personally include at least repealing most of, if not all of, the Gender Recognition Act, because it was brought in a time before we had equal marriage. That was the point of it. We now have equal marriage, so you don't actually need to change your sex to get married to somebody of the same sex, if you see what I mean. So I think there's a strong case for that. There's also a strong case for repealing the public sector equality duty, because that is something that has encourage schools, hospitals, etc., to promote the protected characteristics, not just to defend people against discrimination, which is what they should be doing.
Lottie, let's just bring you in as well, because one of the factors that we didn't mention earlier when we said, how has this happened, is, the increased emphasis on child rights, maybe the Gillick competence stuff, the idea that children are making the decisions rather than the grown-ups in the room.
I just think that argument is, if you talk to any 15-year-old girl or 16-year-old girl, it wasn't that long ago that I was a 16-year-old girl, and, it's really, really clear that you're not mature enough to make these irreversible, and actually Cass says in her report that lots of people, particularly women, don't actually inhabit a stable sexual identity until their mid-20s. So, you haven't actually finished developing until you're in your mid-20s. The current cohort of girls, this new phenomenon of girls that we have 5,000% increase, those girls are not yet, they're kind of still they're not quite in their mid-20s yet, or they're kind of getting there. We don't have the data, the studies on them yet to see what's causing this. But I would say about the whole child right thing, if a 15-year-old said to a teacher at school, I'm texting an older guy, but it's fine because I know exactly what I'm doing. It's absolutely fine. I'm 15 and I'm texting a 40-year-old, but it's because I'm really, really mature, and lots of 16-year-old girls do look really mature, and actually 16-year-old girls, girls and boys hit puberty at different times, and often, girls do look older. That teacher would never go, oh, okay, yeah, no, she's really mature, it's fine, because she's dating a 40-year-old, but she says it's fine. Yeah. And why is this any different, Because
a good point.
so I would say on child rights, I would say again, well, what about parental rights?
Yeah, or parental responsibility perhaps
Yeah.
as well. Yes, sir. I was going to ask this guy with the beard, and then I'll ask you.
Well, thank you. Jim Murray from Liverpool. I'm a lawyer, and I was going to ask a question very much like my previous colleague. It is quite clear to me, and I'm sure the panel as well and the audience, that the Labour Party are at sea in respect of this and this whole thing, and they don't know what to do. And Rishi Sunak and the Tory Party can put really blue water, specifically blue water, between us and them, if in fact they made a definite guarantee that they would be changing the law. Every parent, overwhelmingly the parents, because of the human condition, overwhelmingly parents are concerned about their own children, and the grandparents as well. We could make a killing in respect of this.
Okay. I mean, Fuchsia, do you fear for a Labour government making things worse?
Yes, people. I think people are very, very concerned that at the moment there is already, in many respects, de facto kind of conversion therapy ban in the way parents are treated. I mean, we have some parents who've been arrested. We had one parent who had to spend the night in a prison cell because of CPS coercive control guidance around non-affirmation, and the child was actually an adult with psychosis, and the police took it at face value, and yeah, she was, and so that is already the status quo. I mean, and already the default for therapists is to affirm. It's very, very difficult to find a therapist who will look at it openly, and across the NHS, the default is for affirmation. So we already know what it's like without any kind of legal force to kind of coerce people to do that. So it is quite frightening, and the prospect of parents being actively criminalised for, in addition to just for trying to protect their child from medicalisation and harm, is a very frightening kind of dystopian kind of view. And I mean, you know, we often talk about, well, which countries would be okay to go and live in if the worst was to, because it is, you know, we've seen what's happened in countries like Australia and in Canada and in parts of America where parents are just absolutely completely cut out the loop, and parents have been sent to prison for not going along with this, and you know, with the whole child right, you know, so children are given almost complete autonomy to decide to have the most irreversible invasive treatments from a very young age, when there's no evidence that that treatment is appropriate or is going to benefit them or anything. So yeah, I mean, it is a bit frightening, I'll be honest.
No, fair enough.
For parents.
Let's ask this chap here.
Thank you for all
Then
the
I'll come
work
to you.
you've been doing, and I just want to commend you on your bravery, because it's certainly something that I lack at university, and I feel that if there's kind of good intellectual analysis of what gender is, what's going on here, a lot of people arrive at very sensible conclusions, but very rarely does intellectual analysis happen, particularly in the institutions that have been set up to look into things like this, and that would look into child safeguarding, that would look into good policies, that would write these kinds of things. And it seems to be confined to the Conservative conference, and this is the first time. There's loads of things. I'd love to talk about porn, I'd love to talk about all this stuff, but we can't do that in an hour at a conference. It needs to be kind of long-term in our universities, and I'm not sure that the current laws in place to protect freedom of speech in universities are sufficient. Thank you.
It's a good point. I mean, just on that, interestingly, I interviewed Graham Linehan, and it's coming out tomorrow online, and it's in the magazine. You know, obviously he's made a lot of enemies, and we just discussed the fact that, is the tide slightly turning? You know, I think the discourse needs to be as polite as possible and as dignified as possible and as respectful as possible, which it isn't on both sides sometimes. But I still think that, you know, there's no crime against having the conversation. I think there is a bit too much reluctance for people to kind of just stay silent when I think there are huge amounts of the population actually looking at all this stuff, tearing their hair out, And they're just wanting a few people to cling on to go for that. I mean, Graham made the point that in the comedy world, you know, you had Jonathan Ross and Richard Ayoade endorse the book. And he said the irony of it all is I only needed a few more just to kind of push it in one direction. He said, of course, that he thought when J.K. Rowling came out, he'd be fine because nobody could question her left-wing libertarian credentials, and she's a multimillionaire, so she's untouchable. But of course, she's female, and therefore it wasn't as easy for her. We kind of concluded that Ricky Gervais was the only person who was able to speak freely. Anyway, madam, you were going to ask a question.
I'm Irene Gallagher. I'm the chair of the LGBT Alliance. And I actually just wanted to make a point, actually. A lot of these kids who are distressed will grow up to be gay, lesbian, bisexual people, or might be straight. So we've had a campaign for a long while about puberty blockers and saying, you know, gay teens aren't sick. And a lot of what's happening now is it's not very popular to be gay at school or lesbian. It's very popular to be trans, and there is a trend thing about it. So I just want to make a little advert because we've got a session tomorrow, a little gathering at 5:30 that I hope you come along to. Please come along to our stand and get an invitation. There's a very moving little film about puberty blockers and puberty and what puberty blockers actually do. It's sort of 2 or 3 minutes. But if you can come along to that, and I just wanted to say thanks again to Anne Jenkin because she's been such a supporter of ours at the Alliance. Can I also do one other thing that you did say, Camilla, there that, you know, both sides are equally or aggressive. I have to say, on our side, I mean, there might be some people who call themselves our supporters and say some things, but the aggression really tends to come from one direction, and it's serious aggression and it's threats. We want to debate. That's why we formed the Alliance, because Stonewall wouldn't debate.
No, to be fair, I mean, we've seen aggression coming in one direction when we walked into this conference. You know, it's ever thus. I sort of thought, when would you get a load of right-wing people outside the Labour Party conference shouting scumbags at people? So, you know, the irony. It's not about right or left, but right or wrong. I make the point that, you know, obviously I've been on GB News this week. It's been an interesting week. Yes. And I think the argument is lost on any count if there is a lack of politeness and decency to the discourse. And sometimes, you know, some of the stuff Graham said, I get that he's a beacon out there, but I'm thinking you're not doing the cause any harm if you're actually being rude. I mean, we have to have respect for people who want to be known. I don't have a problem using pronouns. Do I find the concept ridiculous? Yes, I do. But if somebody wants to be referred to in that way, we've got to be polite. Otherwise, I think you do lose the argument, and then you're kind of lowering yourself to the opposition. Sir.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name's Andrew Sheldon from Essex, and it's a pleasure to hear such, you know, I think, very affirming things here at conference. So my own particular experience, I have a stepdaughter who came out of lockdown, came back for a visit from her father, and came back with statements aged 10 about her gender and her sexuality that I'd never expected a 10-year-old to hear. And of course, being a concerned parent, what I do, I go and look through her YouTube stuff that looks incredibly innocuous, stuff that the filters would never pick up. But it starts off with questions like, do you not feel the same? Do you feel different to other people? Oh, that must be down to your gender, your sexuality. And then, of course, looking back on it as well, going forward, you know, for some reason, to speak to her friends about it, oh, I'm this, all of a sudden, attention. Attention gets reaffirmed, oh, it's suggested looking at this, and it builds up and builds up and builds up until eventually, you know, they've forgotten what the initial problem was. And what 10-year-old knows what their own body is, right? Exactly. It's just all of a sudden they feel like they're on a roller coaster they can't stop because they're almost addicted, I know it sounds bizarre, to that attention. Attention they really should not be experiencing at that age. Yeah. So I really do see how it happens. I'd urge parents to, you know, if to really do keep a very close eye on their kids' social media interactions. It's really not easy, particularly when, you know, kids get very upset when you take away their phone, but yes. It's really not easy. So the two questions I've got, the first one is just about this. There seems to be this, as you say, this logjam in the DfE where people seem to be confusing or putting greater emphasis on being concerned about equalities and infringing on equalities than safeguarding. I've seen my own partner works in I can't say which branch of government she works for, but day after day after day, she sent diversity and inclusion, you know, seminars and mandatory attending to these things. It's almost like my concern is that it's really kind of the overemphasis on equalities within the civil service and being scared to, precisely as you say, you know, go against that for safeguarding. I think is probably where the logjam is, and how can we overcome that? The second thing is, you say about trends, and for me, I feel exactly the trend has moved on. It started off when, it was trendy and cool to come out and challenge your own sexuality at secondary school. Now it's gender. The next big concern is, if we don't get this right, what's the next thing going to be in that trend to be rebellious? So I work in education in my political role, and I've had teachers come to me off the record and say, I've had some of my pupils come to me and identify as furries.
Yes, that is a thing.
And, of course, for the people who don't know what furries are, that was about 10, 15 years ago, a big vogue thing with people dressing up in animal costumes for sexual reasons. Now, it used to be dressing up when you dress up in costumes, right? That was what kids used to do. They used to dress up as, cats and whatever and pretend to be cats and dogs. Now they are referring to themselves as furries.
Yes.
They go online and Google furries. Deary me, completely different set of things. So
yes.
Say, are we concerned about where the next trend is going to be if we don't get this right?
Who wants to take that?
Do
you want to?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to.
So have a quick word, all of you, on that one, because we need to bring it to a close in a second.
Yeah, I would say that the trend thing is really relevant. When I was at school 10 years ago, it was self-harm. That was the thing that we were all doing. And there's a real kind of, there's a lot of power in victimhood. And, if you're kind of an awkward schoolgirl and, you don't really fit in, you haven't got loads of friends or whatever, suddenly you can become this shiny new thing. And Stonewall and these other groups are very, very, they definitely play to that. And I've seen a lot of these videos, I've watched a lot of these videos, and they talk about they were just this awful, lonely, sad person that didn't belong in society. And then now they're brand new, shiny, everything's great, everything's brilliant. And it's incredibly seductive. And yeah, it is. It's a rebirth. You're this ugly duckling, and then you become this swan, and it's all. And especially if you're doing it at school, no one wants to upset you. No one wants to offend you. You become you become famous in a way. And for teenage girls, that is very attractive. So I mean, I the next trend, I'm so wrapped up in this one. I don't know what the next one is, but I want to get through. I want to end this one first.
There's still a lot of money being pushed into this, and in terms of, and I think it's really important to realise that if you are a charity in the children's sector, it's very, very difficult to access grant money unless you go along with all of this. I mean, and it's actually kind of dependent on you kind of signing up to the whole kind of TQ plus IA or whatever, in order for you to access grant money. So there are very powerful financial incentives to keep this trend, the current trend, for as long as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing. Perhaps a note to finish on, Miriam. How do you counter that? Because it's quite top down, all this. It's the institutions saying this, we must sign up to this, we must do this, the DfE must kowtow to lobby groups. It's not bottom down, is it? Because there aren't that many sort of working class people banging on the government's door to say, oh, I really do think that we should be transing more children.
No.
So
Zero. Yeah. None.
So how does one deal with the incident? It's a bit like the knee-jerk reaction to Black Lives Matter. Yeah. It's like, we must all sign up. Yeah. We must all be doing this. What does it? I mean, it's for the Conservatives to take that on, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's very sad that we only have 1 year left, because had we started in 2010 to repeal what is the legacy of Blairism, then we might have got somewhere.
What do you mean you've got 1 year left?
Well, to do, we've got 1 year. If we want to bring legislative change before the election,
right.
We've got 1 year. Obviously,
what you were saying.
Oh no.
Well, we know you're in last chance saloon, but come on.
No, but in terms of to turn, though, hopefully we could put it in our manifesto. And I do think, that is the problem with the Equality Act. It has become, as Kemi Badenoch so eloquently put it, it's become a sword and not a shield. And it's now being used to advance the cause of more and more special interest groups, effectively, rather than being a broad kind of platform that just stops individual British people being discriminated against, which we could all agree with. And I do think, yes, we need grassroots pressure, absolutely, but we do need legislative change. And we've got to get rid of the public sector equality duty. We've got to get rid of the Gender Recognition Act. We've got to look again at the Equality Act, because the protected characteristic of gender reassignment is an anomaly. All the other characteristics are things that are objectively true. Your race, your sex, whether you're pregnant or not, whether you're married or not, you can say, you can say you're married, but if you haven't got a marriage certificate, it's junk. But the problem with the gender recognition criteria is it's just what you say, and it can change from day to day. It is absurd to have a law based on something that is entirely emotive and subjective. So I think we've got to reform the whole lot. But in order to do that, you've got to have the political capital within the Conservative Party. And this is why, coming back to somebody's earlier question about, engaging more MPs, it is urgent that we do that, because if we were to bring any legislative change, we've got to have the vast majority of Conservative MPs on board in order to get any change through Parliament.
Right, well, it's 3:59, so we'll bring it to a close. Thank you, Fuchsia, Miriam, and Lottie. Don't forget, there are Lottie's reports at the back of the room. The LGB Alliance is wanting you to go to their event. They're not TERFs, they're just lesbians. Don't be frightened. Don't be scared of them. And everyone have a great conference. Thank you very much.